So everybody, thanks so much for listening to Fire Breathing Rob. Whatever platform you're listening to us, whether it's YouTube, the radio, the podcast, we appreciate that. And we're definitely trying to pump up the numbers. So please subscribe, like, share, pass this interview on to your friends and family. Greatly appreciate that. Today we have Stephen Davis on. He is an investigative reporter. We're going to be talking about that, but also talking about a new book that just came out in September on the 7th, and is Flight 149, a hostage crisis, a secret service, a secret forces unit, and the origins of the Gulf War. So we're going to bring you back to the 1990s here with this invasion of Iraq, and we'll talk about that in general. Stephen, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Rob.
All right, so Stephen, let's kick this around before we even get into the book, because I definitely want to dive into that book a lot. Can you tell the audience a little bit about you in general?
I'm a Kiwi, and that's where I'm speaking to you from lovely Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've been a journalist all my life. That's all I ever wanted to do. Mostly an investigative reporter. Spent most of my life overseas. Helped to start up a new national newspaper in the UK called The Independent on Sunday. At one stage, I was the Los Angeles correspondent for the London Sunday Times. And I've worked in television, making programs for 60 Minutes in 2020, and journalism education, developing a new journalism degree, and now writing. So all the different tasks I've done, the theme is journalism, and I'm a passionate believer in the value of journalism, and especially in this day and age. Also, my most recent project was developing and studying misinformation and disinformation online. And sadly, that's a very growth industry.
Go back to the Iraq War. There was so many lies by the media in this country and even around the world, but especially this country. I look at the New York Times and all the misinformation that was pushed toward getting into that war in Iraq. So, you know, we look at that organization such as the New York Times, and we think of it as in this country as such, you know, a great organization of news, and they're not going to give us, you know, the bad news. That, you know, you look at that as Facebook and Instagram and that stuff where you get all that garbage. But they have in the past, you know, led us into Iraq, you know, with, you know, the Bush administration pushing them to report, you know, this fake news. I believe that's personally where fake news started, was, you know, at that time period. And then it slowly grew. You know, the United States has been pushing propaganda. You know, we talk about Russia in this country, and Russia in the 2016 election, in the 2020 election, along with China. We've been doing that in elections all around the world, in Central America, in South America. So, you know, my question, I guess what I'm getting to with this is, the United States' hands aren't as clean as the media projects them. Do you agree with that, as far as, you know, pushing, you know, these coups, this misinformation? You know, we saw that in Venezuela too, within the past couple of years, where Guaido and as far as that goes. So, you know, what is your take on that? Because millennials like me and other millennials that listen to this, they see this stuff on CNN, in the New York Times sometimes, that there's a lot of gobbledygook out there, even in these mainstream outlets.
Okay, so there were 3 points I'd like to make on this.
Right.
First, a very important point about definitions. Okay, misinformation is something that you might get sent, say, by your slightly eccentric uncle, who sends you a post saying, gee, Rob, I've discovered this amazing thing. If I take the vaccine, I become magnetized. Okay, that's obviously wrong, but your uncle believes it to be true. Disinformation is things distributed sometimes by government and intelligence agencies, which which they know are not true, but which are intentionally designed to deceive you. Okay, so important to get that up front. First off, and we'll discuss this later, but in my book, Flight 149, you'll see that it wasn't Iraq 2003 that started all this business. It was many years before.
Sure.
As far as Judith Miller of the New York Times, we should be careful here. She was deliberately misled by a source who had a who she had a probably inappropriate relationship with. Now, the New York Times reported it thinking it was true, and it was not. So that's not like the newspaper deliberately trying to fool somebody. It's the newspaper being fooled itself and probably not undergoing sufficient checks and balances. To get back to my earlier point, when they found out, they did their own investigation and they owned up to it. It's also interesting. I hear a lot of young people, such as yourself, a different age group than me, talk about the weapons of mass destruction issue.
Sure.
Now, again, well, we live in a black and white world where you have to be absolutely for, absolutely against something. I covered the Iraq War in 2003.
Okay.
There was an interview, a huge amount of interviews with Saddam Hussein's scientists afterwards, about 200 of his top scientists. And they all believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction programs. They just believed it was being kept secret from them. Mm-hmm. So we should absolutely 100% condemn the Bush administration for misusing the intelligence, mm-hmm. for taking us to war under a false premise, and there should have been severe consequences for that. That's true. But it's also true, Rob, when you really delve into the history, that they all actually believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction programs, even though they didn't have the solid intelligence to support it. So you see what I mean? This was a sort of crime of reporting and disinformation, and it was a crime of hyping up the intelligence, but one step below outright deceit, because, as I said, everybody thought mm-hmm. that he had WMD. When I was training to go off to war, we were training to wear the chem hat suits and do all of that. So, and your comments are interesting, and it's not that I disagree with them, but
no, that's fair.
One of the, as I said, one of the real problems with, especially with young people who consume social media mostly, mm-hmm. is everybody seems to want to jump to an opinion. You're absolutely for, you're absolutely against something. And my experience as a journalist after all these years, a lot of issues are not actually black and white. Yeah. They're often quite complicated. There are often gray zones in between. And that fits in. And look, the New York Times is not perfect. They've got things spectacularly wrong, nor is the BBC, nor is the Guardian. And journalism is not, but they are very, very much better, trust me, than the alternatives.
Right. No, my thing is, my thing was with Iraq was, I listened to, and I'm sure you were there. I'm not trying to discount any of that. Going back into these documentaries, Wesley Clark, who was in the Clinton administration, ran NATO. There was a talk that he was in there, and he said he was talking to people in the Defense Department in the Bush administration, even before 9/11 happened, and they said they wanted to invade 7 countries. Iraq was on that list. That's not me just making up, fake. This is unrecorded by Wesley Clark, and I would think that somebody of his magnitude would know that. My thing was just like, Saddam and Bin Laden hated each other. We had 9/11. We never really went fully hard after Bin Laden. That was the thing that I thought we were supposed to be doing. And everybody kind of turned toward Saddam Hussein instead of turning toward Bin Laden. I mean, it took us 10, 11 years. They got Bin Laden in 2011 in the Obama administration. I mean, come on. I just think yeah, go ahead.
So, and that you speak to an interesting point, and one of the major features of my book, Flight 149, mm-hmm. is going back before 2003 to the events of August 1990. It's a sort of a really unexamined part of history. And what you said about Saddam and Bin Laden is very important. So, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Remember that Saddam Hussein previously was an American ally. Mm-hmm. He was an American ally against Iran. Rumsfeld went to Baghdad to see him, And we supported Saddam Hussein as the kind of dictator we liked, as opposed to some of the other kind. And he had a border dispute with Kuwait over oil, inevitably. And it's actually a rather simple dispute. There was a big oil field, which was half in Kuwait and half in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein thought the Kuwaitis were stealing some of his money. It could have probably been solved diplomatically, who knows? But anyway, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And what followed was really a huge turning point in history, which people haven't looked at seriously. When he invaded Kuwait, a very wealthy, the fear was, will he go on to invade Saudi Arabia and control even more of the world's oil supply? A very wealthy Saudi went to the Saudi royals and said to them, I will raise an army of holy warriors and I will do the job for you. I will go into Kuwait and kick out Saddam Hussein. But please do not allow American troops to come into sacred Saudi soil. The offer was rejected. Then Dick Cheney and Norman Schwarzkopf flew to Riyadh and met King Fahd. And they said, we can solve your problem. Let American troops come in and it will protect your kingdom and it will protect our oil and everybody will be happy. And much to everybody's surprise, in the book I explained, Schwarzkopf basically fell off his chair in shock. The king said yes. And so all these American troops started arriving on what was sacred Saudi soil. And the wealthy Saudi who had made the offer, Osama bin Laden, was furious and then swore revenge. And that revenge led to 9/11, which led to Afghanistan. Now, Richard Clarke, who's a senior Clinton official, counterterrorism official, there's an amazing quote I found, which is in the book. And basically he says everything disastrous that's happened in the Middle East for the last 30 years, right through 9/11, Afghanistan, the 2003 war. See, there would have been no 2003 war. Failed states. He says millions and millions of dead, billions of dollars worth of damage and blood can all be traced back to this one decision. Now, the decision was made on the basis that Cheney and Schwarzkopf were telling the king that Iraq was threatening Saudi Arabia. But my book reveals that the intelligence on the ground was saying the opposite, that the Iraqis were digging into defensive positions in southern Kuwait. They did not look like they were going to invade Saudi Arabia at all. So actually, if we're talking about misuse of intelligence, Rob, the 1990 misuse of intelligence is far greater and has far more devastating consequences, I would argue, than 2003. Indeed, there would have been no 2003 but for August 1990.
In the madrasas in Saudi Arabia, which are funded by rich Saudis, it wasn't just Bin Laden, or there's a lot of rich Saudis that fund this. And I believe personally, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you may know more about this than me, that people inside the government are funding some of these madrasas. Maybe it's not the top people, but it's the bottom people that still have a lot of money. And these madrasas are taught to hate Israel, hate America, hate the West in general. So, my thing is, you got 15 out of the 19 hijackers from Saudi Arabia. Then you got to hear the story that you just told, which I'd never heard before. I've heard bits and pieces, but it just seems like we went to war in Afghanistan. Obviously, Bin Laden was there. The Taliban was supporting Al-Qaeda. As far as that goes, we really should have been at war with Saudi Arabia then. Is that correct then?
So the Saudis are an interesting one. As you said, most of the hijackers were Saudi, and one of the great questions still to be answered if the Biden administration releases the secret documents is to the level of support that they receive from rich Saudis. As far as the madrasas go, you're completely correct. But these, by the way, are not just in Saudi Arabia. They're all over the world in places like Pakistan. The Saudis fund a lot of the schools in Pakistan, and they absolutely follow this fundamentalist Wahhabi ideology, which is antithetical to our values in the West. And you're quite right. I mean, if you were pointing the finger at who was the guiltiest, as it were, over 9/11, you would point the finger at Saudi Arabia. Why did we not have a conflict with Saudi Arabia? There's one simple word that sums that up, Rob: oil.
Oil, yeah.
Oil.
No, I hear you. I mean, they still haven't changed. I mean, you look what happened with Khashoggi a couple of years back. I mean, come on. It's a joke. I mean, this guy was a US citizen too. And they murdered him, and it came out, and nothing happens. Why did the US, and I know you'll probably answer this with the oil answer too, but George Bush had Bandar Bush, who was the ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Bush administration, that they called him Bandar Bush. And so, because they were so close to the Bush family in general. Obama comes in, he bows down to the Saudis. I know there was a lot to make out of that because people were calling Obama Muslim and all that other stuff. Trump's, buddy with Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And we haven't really seen much with Biden yet. I think it's still up in the air of how he's going to be towards the Saudis. But most of these administrations have been extremely cozy with Saudi Arabia. Is that basically because of the oil and the embargo? And, we go back to all that stuff too?
It's a two-part. By the way, Biden probably, now that the US has become more self-sufficient in energy with fracking, etc., of course, the importance of Saudis to the American administration has slightly decreased. But the answer is in terms of the long-term relationship, which started immediately after the Second World War, by the way, with the Eisenhower administration. And it's oil, but it's also this weird thing that although the Saudis fund radicalism throughout the world, they themselves are, of course, of a conservative monarchy. Mm-hmm. And so the fear in the West has always been that there would be an Iranian-type revolution in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And so a group of radicals would run Saudi Arabia. Now, you can argue about the word radical, but as I said, the Saudis, Saudi royals, while funding a radical ideology in the rest of the world, suppress it vigorously at home, and they're a conservative monarchy. I mean, that's what Saudi Arabia is. People forget it's an extremely conservative monarchy with a king and so forth. So, yeah, so that plus oil. You can't, when you're discussing the Middle East, get very far from that word.
As we go in, can you tell the viewers, Stephen, a little bit of the investigative reporting that you've done in the past and even in the present?
So I've done a number of major investigations. One of the big ones, which made worldwide headlines about 18 months ago, was the sinking of the ferry Estonia in the Baltic. Right. It's not really a well-known story in the West, but it was a huge disaster. 852 people drowned. It's the worst shipping disaster in Europe since the Titanic. The reason, sadly, that you didn't hear that much about it in the United States is no Americans died. So therefore, the suggestion was the Americans weren't interested. We did this big investigation into why the ferry sunk. And I uncovered an interesting relationship with the intelligence agencies. So MI6 and the Swedes and the Estonians were running a secret smuggling operation, smuggling stuff. As the Soviet Union collapsed and became Russia, a lot of Russian KGB agents were kind of offering their services to the West and trying to make money and ensure their future. And they were smuggling secret stuff through Estonia to Sweden on this ferry on a regular basis. And there was stuff smuggled on the night that the ferry sunk. And the Swedish government said it would bring the ferry to the surface, and instead it did the exact opposite. It buried it in concrete. So that was a major investigation. And 18 months ago, when we revealed there was a mysterious hole in the side of the ferry, which destroyed the official explanation of events, I worked with an amazing team of Norwegian journalists in a Discovery Channel documentary, which I think is available in the States, a 5-parter. I appear on camera, which I hate, but there you go, had to do it. So that's one of my major investigations. I've done a lot of reporting into intelligence services, and special forces operations. And the start of Flight 149 investigation was when I was on the news desk of the Independent on Sunday in August 1990, and a plane had landed in Kuwait, and all the people on board had been taken hostage by Saddam Hussein, who had just invaded Kuwait. They were soon to be known as human shields. And 3 days after Flight 149 landed, I had a call from a friend saying, you should look into this. What they're saying about it isn't true. And that, of course, to an investigative reporter is like, you know, the starting gun. And 30 years later, I've investigated the story for 3 decades, nearly half my life, actually.
Wow.
Maybe because I'm slow, or maybe because I'm very determined. The US and UK governments have been very determined to keep this a secret, and I've been very determined to get the truth out there.
Right. So let's talk about the book again. For people that are listening, Stephen Davis, A Hostage Crisis, and we're going to be talking about Flight 149. So bring us back to the 1990s. You know, tell us a little bit about the story and even how you got involved in it in general.
So after that phone call in August 1990, I started investigating, and about a month later, Mrs. Thatcher made a statement to the House of Commons, and she said Flight 149 landed and everybody got off and it refueled, and all this happened before the invasion started. She emphasized that point in the comments. All the plane landed and all this happened before the invasion started. Now that statement was probably one of the most untrue statements ever uttered by a politician in public. And of course, that's a very high bar, as we know. There's a lot of it. And my sources told me that, in fact, the invasion had started when the plane was 4 hours flying time from Kuwait and had been allowed to fly on. So that was the start. That's what drove me on. Something is not right here. So to recap for your listeners, Saddam Hussein has gathered troops on the border of Kuwait, is threatening to invade. A British Airways Flight 149 is sitting on the tarmac at Heathrow waiting to take off. It's a 2-hour delay. At the last minute, a group of young men get on board and go to the back of the plane. A lot of the other passengers looked at those young men and thought, they look like soldiers. What's this all about? The plane takes off and it flies from London to Kuwait. Kuwait was only a refueling stop. It was going on to Madras in India and Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. On board are nearly 400 passengers and crew.
Wow.
When the plane is 4 hours flying time from Kuwait, the invasion starts. Every other flight is turned away, warned. But BA 149, British Airways Flight 149, flies on and lands at the airport. And as it lands, Iraqi tanks have invaded, and the Iraqis are already at the airport. And soon afterwards, the airport is bombed by MiG fighter planes. And all of those people on board are taken hostage and become human shields for Saddam Hussein, except this group of young men at the back of the plane who disappear and are never seen again. And that's the secret. Now, that word human shields, by the way, all of these people were put at installations all around Iraq and Kuwait where Saddam thought the Allies might bomb. That's where the word human shields comes from. They were literally human shields against the bombing. Ironically enough, in 1990, Saddam Hussein actually had weapons of mass destruction programs. So a lot of these people ended up at nuclear and biological facilities. They were held hostage for up to 4 months. They were treated absolutely appallingly. There were rapes and other sexual assaults, other physical assaults, mock executions, near starvation conditions. As an example, one group were taken out of a camp in the middle of the night, driven out in the desert. It was dark. They got off the bus. The Iraqi soldiers gave them shovels. They made them dig a deep trench, They made them crouch in front of the trench. They lined up behind them like a firing squad. And these people obviously at that moment thought they were going to die. And then there was a click and the Iraqis fell about laughing. It was their idea of a joke, but of course, terrible psychological torture. So two things happened after that, Rob, which have kept me going all these years. One is the British government and the US government lied about why the flight was there. And secondly, a report was commissioned into all the terrible things that happened to the human shields in captivity. But it was immediately declared an official secret and still to this day has never been released. So these poor people who were on that plane were lied to about why they were there, and also denied even the public recognition of the terrible things that happened to them. Now, I've interviewed a lot of people over the years on this, and there'll always be a moment in the interview where they remember something. A lot of them suffered from PTSD. They'll start to shake or they'll start to cry. This has had a terrible effect on their lives. And I'm have always been very angry that the whole thing was covered up.
So bringing this story out into light, when you, like you said, the US government, the UK government, they don't want that out there. Have you created a lot of enemies that, I guess so, people are not too enthusiastic about the book then?
Yeah, I've always had a lot of enemies in this sector. There was a previous attempt, there was an attempt by the UK government quite successfully to stop an earlier version of the book. I have, by the way, been sued several times and injuncted several times by the UK government in the effort to stop stories about intelligence and special forces coming out. There've been a number of court cases. By the way, I have a 100% record of victories against them so far, which I'm fairly proud of. But yes, they're quite hostile. Now, one of the reasons the story has been able to come to light, I have an MI6 source. Now, if you understand, Rob, if you work for British intelligence, you sign a thing called the Official Secrets Act, and that is a lifelong, legally binding confidentiality. You must never, ever talk about your job, ever. If you do, you can be sent to prison. My contact, an MI6 officer called Tony Pace, who was in Kuwait at the time the plane landed, bravely came forward and appeared at a press conference in London alongside me and some of the human shields to tell the truth. So the book is a lot of investigative reporting by me, but I also owe a tribute to him and my other secret sources who basically risked prison to tell me the truth.
So what happened to the secret source that came forward?
Well, at the moment, nothing's happened to him. I think he's being slightly protected by the publicity that has surrounded this. But, you know, theoretically, Rob, they could knock on his door at any moment and arrest him and prosecute him and put him in jail.
Are you worried about something like Assange-ish happening to you or anybody that you are friendly with or know or is a source?
Okay, good investigative journalism always relies on whistleblowers. Those are people who are prepared to risk their careers, essentially, to tell you the truth. Often their motives are variable. You know, some of them were just, I've had whistleblowers who were just disgruntled by the way they were treated within a particular organization, but they nevertheless bravely come forward. It's important for your viewers to understand all governments, in my experience, British, French, American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, whatever, all governments will act viciously and determinedly to protect state secrets. People often think, okay, it's going to be a Democratic president, so it's all going to be okay. It's only the Republicans that do the bad stuff. In Britain, you know, it's Labour will be all right. It's the Tories who do the bad stuff. No, in terms of protecting state secrets, all countries act in this way to suppress whistleblowers. So it's important to understand that. Now, I think it's also important to distinguish the motives, as I referred to, of what the whistleblowers did. It's unacceptable, by the way, that any of them should be mistreated, clearly. My view of Julian Assange is he did a very valuable thing and alerted us to a very valuable thing. but also it was clear he was indiscriminate. A very good journalist called Nick Davies of The Guardian, who worked with Assange in the early days of the disclosure, was struck by the fact that Assange did not seem to care what the consequences of disclosing, for instance, the names of Afghan translators were. So if you're a journalist, whatever you disclose, you must be aware of the consequences to real people. You're talking of real people's lives, their effect on their lives. You can get people killed, you can get people locked up. So I think Assange did a valuable thing. There's no doubt about that. And I think it's completely unacceptable that he's being persecuted in the way he was. Yeah. But he's not a journalist. He wasn't a journalist. And I also think he rather sabotaged some of his own case by being really indiscriminate. It's like Edward Snowden. Again, Edward Snowden alerted us to something very important, a program of surveillance that we should know about. But equally, if you think about it, he took out 1.3 million documents, and he couldn't possibly know what was in those documents. He couldn't possibly know if it was going to get somebody killed. The job of a journalist is to disclose. The job of a journalist is to make governments uncomfortable and hold them into account. But it's not our job to get people killed or risk their lives, ever.
Talk about governments, and, we look back of the Valerie Plame story. And I'm sure you know that. So, and that was by the government, and they basically ruined her life and obviously her husband's too. So I know that.
Yeah, that was completely outrageous. I mean, and that's an example of the lengths they go to retaliate.
Yeah.
And to persecute people if they're saying things they don't like.
As we go toward the end of the interview, again, Stephen Davis here on Fire Breathing Rob. The book is Flight 149, A Hostage Crisis, a Secret Special Forces Unit, and the Origins of the Gulf War. Stephen, what do you hope? Well, first of all, because we have a mixed audience, Stephen. So we have a lot of millennials, but we do have an older crowd that's 50 and older. So let's do this in two parts. What do you hope the millennials learn from this book, and what do you hope the older crowd learns?
Okay, for the millennials, obviously, I think I'm introducing them to a part of history they know nothing about, but they ought to know about. And I also really hope that they read a book like Flight 149 and understand the value of good journalism and good investigative reporting. I know it's easy to look at your media, New York Times and your BBC and pick out their faults, but really, I mean, without them, we would be lost. Without proper journalism, we would be lost. There would be no holding governments to account. There would be nothing stopping them doing the most outrageous things in secret and not telling us about. For the older people who remember the Gulf War, I think that the version of the Gulf War, that the lead up to the Gulf War that they've been sold and that they remember, is incredibly false. And I'm hoping they'll read it and reevaluate what they think about it all.
Stephen, as we end, where can people find more about you and the book?
Okay, I have a site called StephenDavisWriter.com, Stephen Davis Writer with no gaps.com. And Stephen with a PH, by the way, and Davis, no E. And they can find a lot about me and my other investigations and misinformation and disinformation. There's a whole section on that if they're interested.
All right, Stephen Davis, again, definitely get the book. I assume you can get it on Amazon and wherever books are sold then, correct?
Yes, absolutely. The hardcover edition is out, and there's an ebook as well. I don't mind people buying the ebook because I make slightly more money out of that than the hardcover.
Okay. All right. So definitely check out either the ebook or the hardcover. Again, Flight 149, A Hostage Crisis, a Secret Special Forces Unit, and the Origins of the Gulf War. Stephen Davis, thanks so much for your time.
Cheers,
Stephen. All right. Pleasure. Thanks so much. Appreciate you,
Take
Stephen.
care.
All right. Bye now.